The day has finally come. A few days ago, we finally got the firmware update 2.00. I believe it was the 17th, but Fujifilm has finally released the firmware update that allows us to use the built-in ND filter for video mode on the Fujifilm x100v. And you guys know I've been very excited for this. I made a video as soon as I heard the news that it was coming out, and now I'm here with this video too. So essentially in this video, I am going to talk about the firmware update itself, how you guys can get it on your camera, how you can update your camera, and then I'm going to go a little more in depth on how I personally use the ND filter for both photo mode and video mode, and then maybe you guys can draw some inferences of that and use them in your own workflow. Yeah, let's get started. So the firmware update itself, we're primarily going to talk about the ND filter in video mode because that's what this video is about. But if you guys read the list and stuff like that, there's actually a lot of other nice features as well. So how do you get the firmware update on your camera? Well, it's very simple, and all you have to do is search up x100v firmware update. Within the first one or two search results, you're basically going to get a link to the Fujifilm website where you can download the firmware update onto your computer and then put it onto your camera. Essentially, you're going to need an empty SD card formatted, and then you're just going to download and transfer the firmware update onto that SD card. You're going to put it into your camera, and when you put it into your camera, you're basically going to hold the display button while you turn your camera on. And this is going to allow you to go through the steps to update your firmware. And then as soon as you follow the steps, the instructions and stuff like that, you will essentially have the firmware update on your camera, which is very quick, very convenient, very easy. It's awesome. All right, now for the meat of this video, how do I personally use the ND filter in photos and stills mode? So let's talk about custom buttons, because in Fujifilm cameras, you can use different buttons and custom set them to certain features or options in the camera. And I think this is great. It allows you to customize your camera and also use the ND filter very quickly and very easily. So I personally have it set to the FN button. That's that kind of button on the top right corner of your camera. It makes it very quick and simple to just turn the ND filter on and off. I know some people have this feature in the Q menu, but I personally use the ND filter quite often, so I need it with the click of a button. I feel like it's very easy. If you guys want to custom set the FN button to the ND filter as well, all you have to do is turn your camera on, hold the display or back button until the menu shows up, and then search for the custom FN button, and then you can change that to the ND filter. I personally think having the ND filter set to this custom FN button is the best kind of option, at least for me. I think it makes it very quick, convenient, and accessible to use the ND filter. All right, moving on. So how do we use the ND filter, and when should we use it, what situations, etc.? Because to be honest, you should not be using the ND filter all the time. Let's get started with exposure. ND filters are like putting sunglasses in front of your camera. They are a way of controlling exposures, especially when your picture or image is overexposed. That means you have to learn how to expose your picture correctly in the first place. If you don't entirely know how to expose your picture or video, then an ND filter will actually be kind of useless to you, because just using the ND filter is not going to get you a perfectly exposed image. Do you get what I'm saying? So I would recommend first learning aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Those are the main ways to control light coming into your camera, and then use your ND filter as an option afterwards if your image is still overexposed. Does that make sense? So ND filter, the option to use it would come after checking to make sure you have the correct ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So starting with photo mode and stills, how do we use the ND filter? So for photo mode, typically when I start taking pictures, I would look and see if I'm shooting in the correct aperture I want. I generally shoot in aperture priority or manual mode across the board, except for white balance, obviously. With this camera, I typically shoot at f2, which means that I always want to be at aperture f2. So that means I can't change it if I need to control light. So I would have to look to other options in the camera to control that light, meaning I would have to look at shutter speed or ISO. Typically, I would leave ISO at the bottom setting as well, which I believe for this camera is 160. And then my only mode of controlling light would then have to be shutter speed. So changing the shutter speed higher or lower will allow different light to come into my camera. Now, if I've checked these three features, these three options, and I find that my picture is still already overexposed, then I would turn the ND filter on and adjust accordingly. And sometimes the ND filter actually underexposes your camera as well, because what we have right here is a 4-stop ND filter. So if it's not too bright outside, but it is kind of bright, then turning on the ND filter will actually lower your exposure to below where you actually want it to. And then I would turn and compensate the ISO, raise it a little bit until it matches. So it's kind of like an experimental thing. You have to balance here, balance there to make sure you get the right exposure using and taking into account the ND filter. So for photo mode, it's actually quite simple because it is, pretty much I'm in aperture priority mode most of the time. For video, it's a little bit different because if you watch my other video, then you'll know that I shoot in both aperture priority mode and shutter speed priority mode. So how do we use this? Well, if you have it custom set to the custom function, you have quick access to the ND filter. When you are shooting video, you are basically almost always in shutter speed priority mode. Because if you are following the shutter speed rule, then you want your shutter speed to be double the frame rate of whatever you're shooting in. So for example, if I'm shooting in 1080 in 60 frames per second, I would want my shutter speed to be 1/120th. And if I'm shooting 4K in, for example, 24 frames per second, I would want my shutter speed to be 1/148th. This is extremely important because it makes your movement blur and the motion of things in your images look more natural. If you're shooting at varying shutter speeds, then it's going to change how the image looks. Because we are shooting in shutter speed priority mode, then we can't change our shutter speed to compensate for light, right? The only other options we would have for that would be ISO and aperture. Now, oftentimes we are shooting in aperture priority mode as well, because changing aperture kind of changes what's in focus, as well as, what is blurred in the background, or if we want that kind of aesthetic. So typically I would shoot at f4 or maybe even f2 if I'm in control of the shot. So because those things are constant, then all I can change is the ISO. And in an exposed, bright, sunny day, I can't lower my ISO any more than 160, right? So that's where the ND filter comes in. Like I said, we have to check ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and make sure all those things are changed as much as they can be changed. And then that's where the ND filter comes in. So if my image is still overexposed after I've checked those things, then I can press my custom FN button, and then the ND filter will go on, lowering the exposure of my shot. And now, oftentimes it will be underexposed after this, so I would raise my ISO to match exposure, but that's generally how I would control the light in my shots. Nothing too complex about it. Just make sure you know how to get proper exposure. Now, this is great because with the new update and the built-in ND filter for video mode, I can properly get the right shutter speeds to get the right kind of motion looks in my video. And I can shoot in aperture priority mode as well, so I can get what I want in focus and eliminate stuff that I don't want in focus. Does that make sense? And then I can just put on the ND filter with a click of the button, and I don't have to screw on a variable ND filter to control the light coming into my shot. So do I think variable ND filters are useless now? For this camera, I probably honestly won't use it that much just because the convenience of a built-in ND filter is so much more easier. But I don't think a variable ND filter is completely useless anymore, because if you're using this camera for video, for a lot of video, then a variable ND filter gives you a lot more flexibility. You don't have to use an entire 4-stop ND filter. You can use as little as like a 2-stop ND filter, and that allows you to have your ISO at the lowest setting, making your camera and your shots perform as best as they possibly can. So variable ND filters are still useful. I probably just personally won't use them just because it is less convenient to screw on a variable ND filter. But anyways, that is how I personally use ND filters with this camera for photo and video mode. It's a great feature, great option. Thank you, Fujifilm, for finally adding this into our cameras. And I hope this video made sense to you. If you guys still have any questions in regards to ND filters and how I'm using them or how to use them in the camera, please leave them in the comments below because I might have missed something, I don't entirely know. But yeah, if you like this video and want to see more videos regarding the Fujifilm x100v, please go ahead and like and subscribe to this channel and whatnot, and I'll be coming out with a lot more videos in the future. So thank you guys for watching. I will see you in another video. Peace.